I'm Indy Nidell, and this is a Great War live stream special together with Othais from C&Rsenal about British rifles from the First World War.
Alright, I think we've come to that time where we need to discuss rifles. Now, I'm sure nobody is even a little bit excited to see me pick up one of these guys. This is there's a lot of people that care a lot about this gun. This is the British short magazine Lee Enfield Mark III. Now, this particular rifle is a pure Mark III, and I'll get into the details of that in just a second. But this gun came about from a longer Enfield that had been around for the Boer War, and they had sort of learned their lesson about two big problems, which one was accurizing the rifle and also getting the sights dialed in to where they're really usable, and two, the dang thing was so long and heavy that nobody liked it, infantry or cavalry. So Britain made a very good step long before the, well, not long, but you know, a good decade before the war, Britain made the step to go to a standard short rifle. So everybody gets the same gun, and it's kind of short, it's kind of long, it's not as light and flimsy as the carbine, it's not as grossly over heavy as the long rifle. It's something in between, and it does the ticket just right. And it's pretty true. This gun is very well designed around the idea of that .303 British cartridge and getting just the right amount of performance out of it without wasting powder or having a ton of burn off like you'll see with later like number 5 carbines. This is a good system built, again, like I had said with the pistols, out of an existing system. The British really liked reusing what they already had. So we can take a closer look, and I can walk you through some of the details that you guys are going to care about. Now, this is infamously a cock-on-close action, so the cocking piece comes back and sets up our firing pin to fire as we stroke the bolt forward. That means our locking lugs are at the rear, and a lot of people say that's what gives this thing its speed, but realistically what it's doing is, compared to some of the front locking designs, it's saving us some length out of that throw, and that's what's picking us up. We don't have to pull it back as far, therefore we don't have to take as long to operate the gun. Now, there are a lot of fans of this system. I will say, as designed originally, before the inclusion of this piece up here, it made the action kind of weak and prone to torquing out to the left, like stretching out to the left, just because of repeated use. It'd be fine for a couple thousand rounds, but you guys, it's hard to argue with anybody that owns one of these things. They walk out of headspace pretty quickly, even for a rimmed cartridge, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the system's not designed for prolonged wear. Now, the good thing is, at some point, they later added the ability to load from a stripper clip, and they did that when they came into the short rifles. They did it with a Mark I rifle that's really not significant to World War I at this point, although we do have an episode with it included. Then they figured out this nice bridge, and what this does is it allows us to line up the clip and drop our cartridges in, and at the same time, because it's been sort of riveted and welded on here, it's bound the receiver together a little bit better across the split bridge and added a little more rigidity. It's just a good overall solution to a problem that existed from a previous rifle that was not adapted to stripper clip technology. Now, this had been an earlier magazine repeating system, so that's why it started without the benefit of being able to strip rounds into the magazine. You had to singularly load them. And the gun, speaking of single loading, still keeps a magazine cutoff. So in this position, we can only load one round at a time, and then if we pop her out, we can feed from our magazine. So basically, this gun is sort of a compromised evolution of an existing design that was good, and that makes it also good. A lot of people are already getting fuming because they're going to say this is the best battle rifle of the war. I recommend you come check out our episode to see where there are a few little hiccups with this thing, most of it coming from the fact that they used a rimmed cartridge for their ammunition. Most repeating rifles and the reliable bolt actions are going to see rimless cartridges by then, because when you start to move ammo around, it doesn't have a surface to sort of catch on another cartridge. Now, the Mark III, again, standard rifle, and again, we have to produce as many as possible, and as you noted, there's a lot of things like sight protectors and hand guards, and then you got the magazine cutoff and different piling swivels and dial sights. There's all these little bits and bobs that go into that gun. Well, for every one of those bits and bobs that you cut out, you save a number of hours of production time, which means another gun gets produced that day, or another 2 guns get produced that day. And so Britain would make the decision around 1916, even though, weirdly, they sealed the pattern for the things that could be ditched off the gun, they sealed it after they had already started ditching things off the gun. So you have examples that predate the orders to do it, because the manufacturers especially were like, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. Now, that becomes the Mark III Star, so it's just the revision of the Mark III pattern. And I have one here. The big focus are, basically they name three things. There's more little things like whether or not they have unit markings and stuff like that, but the big three things that get named are get rid of the long-range dial sight, get rid of the windage adjustment, and then if you want, you can get rid of the magazine cutoff. Now, because a lot of receivers were already built or set up for it, or because certain units, like naval units, requested that they keep the magazine cutoff for their own doctrine of use, or you have producers like Australia who are just like, well, we're fine, we can just keep including it, we've already got a bunch of them in a pile ready to go. The magazine cutoff tends to actually be present on a fair number of Mark III Stars, even though it could just be gone. It doesn't have to be there. So if we take a look, this particular example has retained its magazine cutoff, but it doesn't have to. It could have been gone. If it had been, they would have just built up the stock higher over where that line would be in the receiver. And they have gotten rid of that fine adjustment dial here, and on the far side we've got nothing. We have no flip up aperture, we have no dial sight. All that's over here is our regular safety. So this simplified pattern is actually the one most people are familiar with, because it would carry on after the war. Yes, some places would still do the magazine cutoffs, but you really don't see the dial sights or windage adjustment coming back post-war. The Mark III Star is sort of it for the Mark III series of Enfield until you start seeing things like the number 4 developed. So that makes this the ubiquitous SMLE that people like to say, although short Magazine Lee Enfield's fine by me. I can spare the syllables. Again, I probably haven't said this yet because people are so familiar with it. I should probably back up just a bit. This, by the way, one of the big things that people like to quote on this gun is a 10-round magazine capacity, which is significant for the war. Definitely of the standard issued rifles, it's double almost all of them. So a good thing about having a higher capacity in World War I is that most nations found that the way their guns got jammed up was not being thrown in the mud or carried around or even, slept on top of or something. Most of the damage to these guns in the muck was done when you took the time to load them. Loading the gun was the time that garbage was introduced and problems occurred. So the one good thing is that mud resistant or not, which it is very mud resistant, but discounting that, a gun that you load less often has less instances or fewer instances of mud getting shoved into the sensitive areas. So it's a good thing when you have a 10-round capacity, because that means that you can sort of isolate yourself long enough to keep it clean to get rounds in there, and then you have 10 rounds of action so that you're not just shoving mud back into the gun. There was some problems with accuracy, although the problems with accuracy they were having was way, way out. You're talking about 1,000-yard shots. We're talking about, sniping essentially. And they were trying to get the action bedded just right, and they were doing all this fiddling. At some point, these guns have very thin barrels at this point. They came out with a heavy barrel model as well, but compared to other guns, this is a fairly thin barrel. It uses a kind of a weird clamping system and, held at the nose cap to balance the barrel out. This is getting into the finer points that we don't need for this video, but basically, when you're pushing 1,000 yards, this starts to walk out a little bit more than some of the contemporaries like the Mauser. I know a lot of people are going to scream bloody murder about that, but it's true. It just, when you are trying to mass accurize, when you're trying to produce them on an assembly line and have them come out accurate, it takes more tweaking to get this system in line than it does, say, a Mauser system. So Britain was aware of this, and they, post-Boer War, they were obsessed with long-range accuracy out of sort of a short rifle-ish pattern close to this length. And they would start developing what would be the Pattern 13, which was an experimental gun that did not get into the war because the war broke out and interrupted that process. But that gun was supposed to use a smaller diameter, faster flying bullet in order to get a nice, flat, long-range shot. And they built the whole gun around heavy barrel, Mauser action, and then what's called sight radius, which is the distance between your front and rear sight, is very helpful to quickly and accurately assessing what you're shooting at. So the further apart these are, the more accurate your shot is, just based off the way the human brain registers that distance and sight radius. So on this gun, you can tell this rear sight's actually fairly far up the barrel, So it's not a strong position on the gun. They could even have walked it back here and gotten a little bit better out of it. Instead, they'd look at a totally new design. And that design, like I said, did not get done for the war, but they had built up all these plans for how to manufacture it. They had the understanding of what they needed to do. It was practically ready to roll. And then the war broke out, and they knew that they couldn't do it at home. But they needed weapons, and they were looking at the US, and they realized that it would be easier to get the US to produce the new gun that was designed for modern manufacturing than it would be to try to train the US how to assemble these things, because they're so finicky about how you have to make them that it would take 2 years to get the crew just right to make this gun. So give the new crew a new gun instead of trying to teach them the weird semi-old world craftsmanship of the Lee Enfield. So that became the Pattern 14, because they took that experimental gun and they turned it into just a regular 303. And that's this guy. So just taking a broad look, very recognizable profile, but let's take a zoom in and we'll see some big improvements. So we have front locking lugs. It is still cock on close. They like that nice fast stroke. We still have the nice bent bolt handle that puts our finger down by the trigger. We have a rocker style safety, although it's better positioned by the thumb instead of across the back of the gun. This is interesting because, remember, this predates the war in design and then was initially rolled out right at the beginning of the war. So this still has the old long-range dial sights and flip-up aperture, because this is before they made the improved or simplified model of the Mark III Star. And then, if I flip it back, we have a aperture sight, which means a little hole that we look through, and the brain is very good at automatically centering that front sight post on the hole, so that makes it very rapid to acquire your picture, to acquire your target. The sight picture has a much longer sight radius, I mean, down the entire length of the gun practically. This is a gun built to be heavy, long range, accurate, with a cartridge that it's no longer chambered in. So this is now set up for 303 British, which it still uses well, and as a matter of fact, these would be preferred by snipers and would be outfitted with, optics and things like that. You're gonna see them even into World War II being favored as a good sniping platform. We're also going to see the US adopt this same gun in 30-06, but we'll talk about that later. This is a terrifically accurate, rugged, war-ready rifle, but it's heavy, and it's new, and it took until about 1917 for a significant number of them to show up. And so Britain would treat it as a second line or dedicated sniping rifle, and that was about it. So not a lot of these, despite like 1.8 million being made, ended up on the front. Instead, they would replace practically everything else so that they could move Enfields to the front. A lot of people probably recognize this, the Canadian Ross rifle. Now, this particular one took a bit to put together, so it's got a few dings and dangs, but she's up and running, and we definitely shot her and done an episode on this gun. This thing is infamous in terms of, basically, people tend to think of it as a suicidal rifle just to use it, which is not an entirely unfair assumption, but I think people go a little too far criticizing this gun. The big thing about this is that it came about because Canada was having a hard time getting equipment from Britain during the Boer War, and then they wanted to set up their own domestic production of the short Magazine Lee Enfield, and Britain was not helping them with that. So they said, well, if you're not going to help us get set up making your rifle, we're going to make our own rifle, and it's going to be cooler, and we're going to kick your rifle's butt. And they brought in a mad Scot, essentially, turned Canadian. Charles Ross has a biography that everyone should read. The man is his own version of Teddy Roosevelt and Hemingway. Anyway, Charles Ross basically takes the Austrian 1895 system and has been working on it for years already, and then Canada sort of goes, well, we could do something with your gun, and he turns it into a straight pull rifle for Canada, and that's like the Mark I, Mark II, and then there's all these problems with it. They finally get it just right, but at the same time, there's a lot of politics around why it doesn't work right, and so then they come out with the Mark III, which is this one in 1910. So this could be called the Model 10 or the Mark III. This is supposed to solve all the problems, and it's actually very different from the earlier Mark II, although it is still a straight pull rifle with the same sort of locking system. And a lot of this was pushed, by the way, by Sam Hughes. And so this gun is really tied to sort of the downfall of Sam Hughes in his political career for pushing sort of a favoritist industry that he was sort of tied to personally above the interests of the Canadian soldiers, because these things just weren't dialed in where they needed to be. And the biggest problem with the Ross isn't that it was unreliable or somehow inferior inherently. The problem was just refinement. Inspection was not good. Testing in rugged conditions was not good. They treated it like a big sporting rifle, and it's a beautiful sporting rifle, but it's not a good military rifle until you make these X number of tweaks. To be fair, the Lee Enfield was the same way. There's nothing about this gun that is so radically different from the earlier problems with the Lee Enfield, except the Lee Enfield received the attention it needed to get to be the final product. So let's take a closer look and just see what the heck I'm talking about. So this is in 303, and it's a straight pull action. You just pull back on this guy, and the system automatically turns to unlock, and then pulls out. Now, the big thing that a lot of people are familiar with this gun, and actually our friend Ian, who you know as well, Indy, has a video on this, is that if you assemble this sort of 180 degrees the wrong way, you can manage to shove this forward, and it will not actually turn into lock. So when you pull the trigger, the whole thing just blows out the back and into your face. So that would be fixed by setting a rivet into the action so that you could not assemble it backwards, which is great, but obviously that could have saved some people some eyesores or potential maiming or death if they had done it a little sooner. But as infamous as that is, that's not the big killer in World War I. The big killer in World War I is a combination of factors that took them so long to track down that by the time they nailed all the problems in this gun, everyone had given up on it. It was pulled from the front lines, and it was never deemed to be used again. The big problem is that the soldiers would use this gun. Here, let me back up for a second. They'd use this gun, and they'd boom, 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 and at some point she gets stuck, maybe 1, 2, 3 rounds in, and then the natural tendency, because it's a straight pull, is that if this bolt is stuck and you really can't get it with your hand, you just set it on the ground and just kick it open, because why not? It's a straight pull. It's got a nice flat surface here. The human tendency is going to be kick it hard, and that's going to open her up. Now, the reason it was tight to begin with was because British ammunition was of looser spec than the Canadian ammunition. And so they would get this sort of odd British ammo. They had a nice tight sporting style chamber, not a wide forgiving military chamber. This is a hyper accurate gun that needs the ammo to be just so. Well, that would cause it to sort of initially bind, and it just, it'd swell up and get stuck. And that's not an inherently horrible problem. You just get to re-ream the chamber, and they would eventually do that. But when you go to solve that little problem by kicking it open, they have, here, let's zoom in. They have a serrated bolt head, so you have these interlocking locking lugs, so a lot like, it's an interrupted screw pattern, a lot like an artillery piece at a time. So what this does is it provides more locking surface. So the surface area of the locking lugs is quadrupled, essentially, well, I guess tripled, from what it normally would be, which is just this back surface here. And it means that this is an extremely strong action, and actually the concept does work. But these individual wings are easier to deform, and you see how they kind of come down to the root of the bolt. There's a bolt stop right here, so when we pull the gun and the bolt stops, it can't pull any further. That's this half circle of metal back in here. Well, if that half circle isn't deep enough to go deeper than the base of this rear left piece, the natural mechanical thing is that it's going to deform it if you hit it too hard. And that's exactly what happened. They made the stop too shallow, and so it was only like 2/3 the depth of this piece that it needed to be so that it would hit the root. And so when you kicked it open, so you have a minor ammo issue. Here, let me zoom out. You have a minor ammo issue. You kick it open to solve that issue, and when you do, you deform the bolt head, which also at the same time they were not properly heat treating the bolt heads. So it deforms that bolt head, and then you go to slam it shut again and fire it again. Well, yes, it's deformed just enough that you can close it, but then when you fire it deformed, you now have a stuck cartridge and a deformed bolt head. And every time you kick it open to solve it, you make the problem worse. So within 5-6 rounds, you've made the rifle practically inert. And so people just hated this gun. And then some guy standing next to you would have a properly heat-treated bolt head, or they weren't kicking their gun, or the chamber was a little... And he just didn't have the problem that you had, or maybe you were part of some division that was given Canadian ammo or something, and you didn't. And so it's this weird report of these guys are fine, these guys hate it. Nobody could figure out what was going on. It wasn't until the British ordered their own pile of these, the Mark III-B, which has a slightly different rear sight. The British ordered them, and they had to send over a British inspector because it was a British order, and he looked around and went, what the heck is going on? Why isn't this that? And so the British inspector sort of helped them sort out what was happening. But by then, the Canadians were so fed up that they were just like, get rid of Sam Hughes, get rid of the rifle, give us Lee Enfields, we're done with it. And so it's interesting though, historically we know all the changes they made, that was the last problem. Like they got all the problems. We know of no other additional problems with this gun after that point, and in kind of reverse engineering these, we don't see any other problems with them, and they're going strong for 100 years, but they solved the problem right before they pulled it off the line, because it's the third problem in a row they solved. They couldn't know that there was not a fourth problem. They just assumed there was going to be a fourth problem and a fifth problem, and so they just got them out of there.
This is my favorite part of this stream so far, this gun actually. That was the most interesting for me. That was a fascinating story. That was great.
Yeah, the Rost rifle is just one of those things where you have 3 interlocking issues, and you have to untangle. Like troubleshooting is great. You got to find, like, you got to reduce it to the one variable, but you have 3 variables that affected this gun, and so it made it very hard to discover what was happening. And this gun was an absolute favorite for snipers because they were given much better kind of match grade ammo. Like snipers were issued better ammo, so they never had the initial problem. So they would just fire their rifle, and then they just work the bolt like a normal person, and they never developed the issues that the other people did. So they would just sit there and dump a ton of oil in it to make sure that it didn't lock up and feed it prime ammo, and they thought it was the best thing in the war because it was very, very accurate. It has an extremely heavy, long barrel. It's getting a lot of muzzle velocity. It's burning all that powder. It's got a flip-up rear aperture sight, or if it's flipped down, you've got a simple leaf battle sight, but it's at the rear of the receiver like that P14, so you have a very long sight radius. It is a beautiful sniping platform. It is a terrible infantry rifle up until those fixes were made. But I think that pretty much wraps us up for our rifles today. There's going to be some other stuff. The British were known to use the Arisakas, the Japanese Arisakas, for naval use, and they would have things like Chilean Mausers. They also bought a handful of commercial arms from the US, but these are all sort of small and away from the front and can be talked about in other episodes or just over at C&Rsenal.
If you'd like to see Othais' video about the Ross rifle, you can click right here for that. Now, you absolutely have to subscribe to his channel, C&Rsenal. And in terms of our channel, do not forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. See you next time.